Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. Are starting a new study in the Songs of Solomon, the Songs of Solomon. And this is a unique book, and I am, as I said, taking some liberties. I'm kind of going back to, I'm departing from our normal just teaching just straight verse by verse through the entire Bible. And I'm taking a little liberties to talk about this presentation, this book. The Songs of Solomon is basically a series of poems, uh, a series of poems about a love story between a man and a wife. Some think it's Solomon. It could be a story, and it could be a story of Solomon. Um, and the reason why I'm taking my time to kind of explain this because we don't often get a chance to talk about sex from the Bible standpoint. So that's why I am taking the liberties to do that. I want to bring some things in with this story right here. The Songs of Solomon, because one of the benefits that I'm going to bring in later is what it shows us potentially of sexual relationships between a godly man, and his godly wife. That's why I'm taking the time to do that. Now, there's a couple of things we need to understand about the Songs of Solomon. That if it is kind of like with Solomon, and we'll see a verse later that kind of identifies Solomon as the lover, okay, as the husband. Keep this in mind that Solomon is not was not the good example of what a godly marriage is. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Okay, so that's why. And when it comes to marriage, very few good examples of marriage. Like, for example, even King David is not a good example of marriage. He had many wives, many children. Abraham, Isaac, right, married to their wives. Jacob had two wives and and concubine slaves that he fathered children by. Uh, Noah seemed to only had one wife, but he was a drunkard. So my point is, there are not a lot of good examples when it comes to marriage, and one reason why is because, remember, sin entered into the world, and that's what you have to understand. Sin entered into the world. Now, so we have to balance that, okay? We have to balance that with what we read right here. And what I do believe is a great example of Song of Solomon is it's going to give us pretty much one example, one to me takeaway is how free and how expressive both male and female within the confines of God's marriage, how free they are to express, to explore their sexuality amongst themselves. So for that, I think one of the worst things you could do is to ask your pastor, because you're subjecting yourself to his opinions. And there are a lot of pastors that have a lot of bad opinions. They force their opinions on something, on depending on what your question is. So we start off again when we look. So this is what the Song of Solomon, I think our takeaway from it will be. Let me also say this: what it is not. Some scholars try to interject that this is an allegory of Christ's love for the church. And that's a stretch. I don't believe that the Song of Solomon is doing that. I mean, without a doubt, we have scriptures, Ephesians 5, that tells us Christ loved the church. He washed the church. What we do not have is a sexual picture of this. Song of Solomon will get, as we will see, very sexual for a biblical narrative. Okay? In other words, if I was to rate the Song of Solomon in today's uh, audience rating, right? I'll put it at a probably PG. P, ma'am, uh, PG because it shows some stuff. Okay, PG, not X, but PG. All right, and so that's why I had my uh, I typed it this way, my thumbnail, a biblical sex story, because that's we're going to see this, not XX, but close. But so one this and this story, this book letter, it does show us, to me, how you should be with your mate, your spouse. Now, what I'm not going to can't get into because it's so lengthy is whatever the healing process one may need to go through, and that's what happens oftentimes. In other words, one of the emphasis on just get married, and I don't, so a lot of churches, I don't know how the in depth. I know sometimes they have marital classes, premarital counseling. I don't know how far that goes, but certainly what should be involved in that is the discussion of sex. What should be the discussion when involved with, especially if you have had previous sexual encounters. And in today's society, the probability of that is probably more than not. And it's certainly the ideals of what we think of sex is. So when people ask the question, again, I'm really going to go out on a limb here because this is not our normal Bible, through the Bible, okay? But if a person asks the question, is anal sex okay? Is oral sex okay? So there's two ways we have to approach that. One, the Bible does not say that between a man and his wife that anything is off limits. You cannot find the scripture that says that. You can't. In other words, between a husband and a wife, they are free to explore each other for the pleasure of each other. That's what God has created. There are women that say, well, that say they've never experienced an orgasm, and you have to ask the question why. They don't think they could have one. Well, if all the parts there, now there is a crazy, and there are these tribes that what they call female circumcision, ungodly, they're crazy, stupid. Who thought of that? Stupid men. Why? I don't. For the life of me, I don't understand why. Stupid men do that. None of the stupid stuff that comes out of Africa. I guess I have to tell you that. But stupid. But the idea is that if you don't have all that mess going on, just think if all of the parts work, you think about what God made. That in itself tells you pleasure was involved. That God intended for marriage to be pleasurable. He made it that way. And and there is no scripture that says that a marriage cannot You are free to explore that. Now, I do not think you need anything in the world from the world, such as, do I need to watch pornography in order to learn how to, have good sex? You're what if you're watching pornography, you're watching a falsehood. It's manufactured. It's acting. When they say action, they start moaning and groaning, and when they cut, they stop. It's action. So if that's your measure, that's what you're trying to use. And so that's why I say. So now the second question is, why is that you think that is going to be pleasurable? It would be better for you and your spouse to explore each other, and then what is good and comfortable, okay, between each other. So let me read one more scripture again, and this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I'll read this again, and then it says, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 1, and this is in the New Testament, and so this thing says, now concerning the matters which you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. In other words, the temptation, because the sexual urge is strong, here is this thing: get married. And notice he almost pretty much says it's almost like it is a very hard urge to overcome and suppress. It can be, but it's hard. So the easiest solution is to get married. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her congenial rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. So this is one of the first times you kind of see this too, where the wife is due pleasure. Okay? For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife do. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may give yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, Paul's going to go on and basically kind of takes the tone where, well, if you can't control yourself, yeah, get married. I think you should stay single, however. All right, but he never infringes on what God created. But the point is that notice here that the sexual urges do not deprive. If you are depriving your spouse, then you are sinning against God. All right, now, so again, part of the so with that in mind, the Song of Solomon gives a picture of, to me, one of the takeaways, a good love story, and that explores desires for one. I'm going to also say this: fulfilled desires for one's mate, for one's husband, for one's wife, how they long for one another, and then how they please one another. So I'm going to say this before I get into this. Now, I'm not going to get into it in this session, obviously, but I want to say this, that if you are living a godly life, the greatest sex you can have is between your spouse. Now, there are people, and again, in the world, right? We all come. Most of us come out of. We all come out of the world, and so you hear people like even challenge whether or not if monogamy is natural. That's what people say. Now, when you hear statements like that, let me just say this too. as a sidebar. Like sometimes when people say, "Well, I was born gay," well, I would say this: you were born sinful for sure. And now, of course, I'm not going to engage here in this setting, but let me just say this: the sinful urges. Now, remember I told you fornication is the sinful, selfish, self-centered use of a person, place, or thing for one's own gratification. That's fornication. And while this is not a judgment, because we're all sinful, and as I said, everybody has an inclination to sin, to certain sins. Some people drugs, alcoholic. Some people violence, murder. But when we come to like in the sexual arena, there are some people who has certain inclinations, same-sex attraction. Remember, this is in a sinful arena. And now, of course, what's being promoted heavenly is um, um, the trans stuff. Okay, the trans stuff. Now, but that's, and my point is, I'm not going to engage that argument. I think Christian churches have made that the boogeyman to their foolishness, to their, because that's in the world, the sinful world. The solution, um, the answer should be come to Christ, just like we all come to Christ. Some people have an inclination for adultery, right, or fornication. And so if you're ever in those kinds of situations, yeah, you're going to fall. When we come to Christ, we are called out of the world. So therefore, we start living a life out from distance from the world, whatever the inclinations are. But I think kind of the greatest relationship is when you are living your life to God, in devotion to God, obeying His word, so that remember there's a scripture in Ecclesiastes where it says, "Enjoy the wife of your youth." Enjoy that. That's what God created. And why? Because if it is a relationship that is built upon godliness, then it's going to be built upon love. That's what's going to make it. That's what's going to cause it to last, if you want to call it. To me, it could get no better than that. If your world is fornications, now watch this. So if it's fornication, now what fits in fornication? Anything outside of the God ordained marriage. And let me just say this, and it doesn't mean that you don't have forgiveness, mercy from God, right? And granted, there are the church has been hypocritical in how it deals with certain sexual sins. They've been hypocritical on that. So, but when you build your relationship on God versus out in the world, as I said before, I'm a married man. So any sex outside of marriage, it is only and always sinful, selfish, self-centered for my own gratification. That's it. Not for the other person. And for that reason, it could never. Now, it can feel good. Listen, it could feel good. Sex always feels good, right? Sex can always feel good. I'll put like this, potentially, it can always feel good. Sex can always. But it can never be satisfying because selfishness cannot be satisfied when you're doing things purely selfish. But the way God designed it is when two come together, then yes, that joining of the union is pleasurable and satisfying as well. All right, guys, we will start Song of Solomon um, next time for sure. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought, a comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. Till next time, I'll see you then.